Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video I'm back talking about the Uncharted series, and here I'll be talking about my thoughts on Uncharted: The Lost Legacy, 5 years after its initial release. And Lost Legacy is a game that I just find really fascinating as a whole. Obviously it was a game that was originally supposed to be a DLC for Uncharted 4 until they ballooned the game to be the length of a full game. Now it is obviously the first game in the series to not star Nathan Drake, and instead star Chloe Frazer and Nadine Ross, two side characters from previous installments that really had no connective tissue pretty much at all. So to see these two characters team up for the series' first major side game was an interesting prospect to me, and I personally think it ended up playing out pretty well, to the point where I wouldn't be upset if this was the style of game that we were to get from the series moving forward. Now obviously with this starting as a Uncharted 4 DLC, this game does play very similar to that game despite the change in protagonist. And that is something that I did find very jarring in this game, is how all of a sudden Chloe is just very skilled at parkour and combat, just like Nate was, despite the fact that we had her as a companion in both Uncharted 2 and 3, where we had to help her along as Nate, with Nate doing a lot of the legwork, particularly from a parkour standpoint, and for Chloe to be just as good as him in this game is just kind of weird to me. Now, while the base gameplay is mostly the same, there are minor additions to the game, most of which are expansions upon the additions that were already made in Uncharted 4, with there now being even larger environments, a heightened focus on stealth, which does fit in with Chloe's character, and the game does also have the inclusion of silenced weapons that really help out with the stealth. There is a lock picking system in the game as well, with the ability to find locked chests that contain some stronger weapons in the game. That also just adds to the variety of ways for you to approach combat sections. Also, Chloe has a smartphone, unlike Nate, and through that you have the ability to take photos at specific points that kind of become a cool new type of collectible here. But really, those aren't the majority of the changes that were made for this game. Now, like my other retrospectives I've done in the past, I will also be running through the game from beginning to end to really just flesh out my thoughts on the game. And with that, let's start from the beginning. Again, we start the game with a short sequence of Chloe in a market as she interacts with Minu, a young Indian shopkeeper who does have a fun personality here and does end up being a notable character despite only being in 2 scenes. But I do really like this scene as a way to reintroduce Chloe that does portray her pretty positively here, with her acting as this like big sister figure for Minu, particularly after she tries to steal from Chloe and Chloe calls her out for it. And while the scene does very blatantly give out exposition in a way that does feel a bit unnatural, it is overall still a strong scene that does also introduce obviously the central plot of the game. But this section does also contain a nice walk through this market that does feel very immersive, especially with Minu following you around and trying to swindle Chloe along the way, but eventually she ends up helping Chloe get aboard a truck after Chloe promises to get her pizza when she returns, which may be relevant to the end of the game. But with that, we do reach chapter 1, which has Chloe now on her own as she travels through the slums, which are infested with rebel soldiers, and we have to reach the meetup point with Chloe's mysterious partner on a rooftop. And this entire section was part of the initial reveal at PlayStation Experience, where this entire section pretty much like played as is, just that Chloe's face was covered. And due to that, I always find this section very memorable, and it is extremely immersive as well to walk through these like dark alleyways with soldiers around every corner. And you have this like really tense scene with Chloe being harassed by some soldiers, and just the overall vibe of this section is pretty intense. Along the way, the game obviously teaches you certain systems in the game, like the lockpick system, stealth system, melee combat. But eventually we do get to the rooftop where we have this really cinematic shot of Chloe looking over the destruction that the army has caused, which again to me has always been a notable moment from that initial reveal, and also felt very not Uncharted-like at the time. But eventually we do reach the meetup point where we are ambushed by soldiers until we are helped by Chloe's partner, who is revealed to be Nadine Ross, which is a fun introduction to her, with her and Chloe working together here to take out the guards. And again, this combination just feels very random at first, but I do really like the relationship between the two, with it starting off here very transactional and even antagonistic at points, but as the story progresses, obviously their friendship ends up blossoming as well. But with that ends up starting chapter 2, which mostly revolves around platforming sections as we navigate the rooftops on the way to the office of the insurgents leader, Asav. And this section plays as your typical platforming section in an Uncharted game, though there is a really cool aesthetic here with you navigating the rooftops with neon lights surrounding you, but eventually we do reach Asav's office, which we can explore, and here we do find a map leading towards the legendary Tusk of Ganesh, which ends up being the main artifact for this game and really brings a personal story for Chloe here, with us eventually learning that Chloe's father was killed while searching for this tusk, really expanding upon her character beyond the shallow portrayal that she was given in previous installments. But here we do get our first interaction with Asav, who obviously ends up becoming the main antagonist and does come off as a really cold, conniving villain here that, while his motives seem pretty basic and kind of a bit undefined to me, I did find him to still be a menacing presence across the game. And here we do also learn about Nadine having a personal vendetta against him as well that does lend more to her character. Afterwards, we do get a really fun set piece as we have to escape from Asav's men, where we once again go rooftop to rooftop while being shot at, and this section just felt very Uncharted-like. And I do think it really shows the player this early on that even though we are playing as a different character here, the core fundamentals of Uncharted's gameplay and structure are still intact here. But with that, we reach chapter 3, which takes us to the Western Ghats, which is where the majority of the game takes place and in many ways feels like a generic Uncharted location. It is a very rocky location that allows for a decent amount of climbing sections, while also having a lot of lush vegetation that gives it a similar vibe to that of Libertalia from Uncharted 4. And this chapter in particular largely feels like a tutorial of things that were already present in Uncharted 4, with things like the grapple hook and vehicle navigation being pretty prominent here, and all of it just plays the same as it did in the main game. You get the first open combat section here, which again does have more of a focus on stealth, but really this chapter doesn't really do much from a narrative perspective, outside of again showing Chloe and Nadine being a bit cold towards each other, particularly at a point where Nadine offers to help Chloe climb up, and Chloe just ends up ignoring her, which obviously later in the game we see a mirror of this scene where Chloe does end up taking Nadine's help, which obviously shows the progression of their relationship. But again, really nothing of note happens until chapter 4, which ends up being one of the more notable elements of this game, with this chapter revolving around this small open world which we can navigate with our Jeep, which does feel like an expansion upon what they did in Uncharted 4, though something that this game does that is even more impressive is the addition of what is essentially side content, which outside of like treasures and optional dialogues, side content has really been non-existent in previous games, where here there are 11 tokens that can be found throughout the open world that when you do so, you can find the Queen's Ruby, which is essentially a tool that tells you when you're near a treasure, obviously making finding those a lot easier, which is a very cool bonus here for exploring every bit of this open world, which again is a cool way to progress the gameplay of this series moving forward, especially considering how this doesn't really affect the game beyond this one chapter, where the rest of the game remains this standard linear Uncharted format that you would expect. But this does allow the game to expand its runtime without really compromising the typical Uncharted experience, where if you want to, you can still just do the main objective of going to these 3 main towers, all of which bring something new to the table, being a mix of combat, climbing, and puzzle sections, with one of the puzzle sections here being really notable to me of the one with you jumping pedestal to pedestal and you having to track the movements of these other statues that go in a cycle and could potentially knock you down. And I always just found that section to be really interesting. And while the core plot here doesn't really progress much during this section, with us spending the entire chapter trying to open the gates to Halabadu, the first of the 2 capitals that we end up navigating in the game, the main narrative appeal to this chapter here is really the discussions between Chloe and Nadine along the way, with this chapter really being the first semblance of downtime between them that allows them to get to know each other. You have Chloe talking about her father and her connection to this search for the Tusk of Ganesh, while Nadine talks about her background, her losing Shoreline, obviously being a follow-up on the events of Uncharted 4, which all of this is really just my favorite part of this entire game. As not only are you getting these two characters getting to know each other better across these scenes, but also the player is getting to know these characters better. Again, these two characters that had already appeared in previous installments, but just weren't as fleshed out as they end up being here. And obviously along the way, we also get some great banter between the two, including some talk about Nate and Sam, where we find out that Nadine still has hatred for the two, blaming them for her losing Shoreline, with this obviously playing a factor moving forward. But really, this entire section of the game is what I think of when I think of this game. It really highlights the major pros of this installment, with all these character interactions, while also including the most notable gameplay section of the game to me. But as I said, eventually we do open the gate and reach the city of Halabadu, starting chapter 5, which ends up giving us a bevy of platforming sections, with a pretty notable section in climbing these massive Ganesh statues, and there being a notable puzzle here as well. There being this like slide puzzle where you have to use these like abstract shapes to create a shadow that recreates the mirror on the wall, and I always found that to be a really innovative puzzle. But through this, we do find out that the tusk isn't in Halabadu, but instead in the older capital, Belur, which makes that our next destination. But along the way, we have the elevator that we're on end up coming loose, leading to this pretty standard set piece of them having to climb to the top while everything crumbles around them. And the aftermath of that does lead to a bit more of a bonding scene for Chloe and Nadine. But afterwards, we do interact with Asav's men once again, with this starting a string of really chaotic fights from this point until the end of the game, where again, it's at this point that the enemies start to get really overpowered weapons, but eventually we are ambushed by Asav himself and have a short-lived fistfight with him, which is a great way to make him an even more menacing villain here, with us obviously losing the fight here, and in turn, we get to what turns out to be the low point for the protagonist here, especially once we end up spying on Asav's forces, only to see that Sam Drake is amongst them, obviously enraging Nadine, who had previously confided her hatred of him to Chloe, only for it to be revealed that Sam is still on our side, with him having actually been abducted by Asav, with this expedition having originally started off between Chloe and Sam, and us now planning on rescuing him, which is a pretty fun reveal and a fun way to bring Sam into this game to further connect this to previous installments, while also having it as a way to progress Nadine's character as well, bring back this past trauma from Uncharted 4. But due to this revelation, Nadine decides to leave Chloe, having felt betrayed, which, I mean, I get her motivation for doing so here, but I still find it kind of dumb, considering they're stuck in the middle of nowhere with a literal army's worth of men hunting them down, but whatever. But it does lead to chapter 6, which starts with Chloe heading to Belur on her own, again feeling like this is the low point for her character, though all of this is kind of quickly undone when we get into this massive combat section that involves having to blow up Asav's military truck, and through this Nadine returns to help us, though their relationship does still remain a bit tense here. But afterwards, we do continue on the path to Belur, where we do get another notable scene where we do end up finding an elephant under a bunch of rubble, and through rescuing it, we're able to ride on top of it, which ends up being a really beautiful scene here, both from a graphic standpoint and also thematically. Now, while this is all being based around this really generic, like, war is bad theme, this scene does still have a similar impact to me to that of like something like The Last of Us's giraffe scene, especially with it coming immediately after the story's low point, and this also coming as a way for Chloe and Nadine to fully reconcile, and after doing so, we get a ridiculous optional scene of Nadine taking a picture of Chloe with the elephants, which was humorous. But after some more platforming sections, we do end up reaching Belur, starting chapter 7, which starts with a pretty massive fight that always stood out to me as one of the more annoying ones in the game, where again at this point, there's a decent amount of enemies that have really powerful weapons and really heavy armor. That leads to this being a bit of a chore. But afterwards, we do get a strong moment for Chloe, where we do come across an altar that on top has a number of ornaments, with there being a slot for one more, and all of these ornaments look just like the one that Chloe's father gave her as a child, which now makes her realize that her father made it this far as well, which did feel like a very similar scene to what happened in Uncharted 1, when Nate has a similar relationship around Sir Francis Drake, with him also coming to the realization of his accomplishments. And through that, this feels kind of like a passing of the torch moment, with Chloe now fully living out her father's dream. Now afterwards, we get a bit of a playful moment for Chloe and Nadine, where after climbing up a cliffside, Nadine ends up pushing Chloe back down, which, I mean, it's actually kind of annoying from a gameplay standpoint as you have to do it twice, but does add to their relationship. We just in general get a bevy of platforming and puzzle sections through this portion of the game, including this set piece of having to climb this massive statue by moving around its arms. We have this puzzle based around placing these mirrors in the right spots to reflect the light properly, that for some reason I always end up finding myself annoyed at that section, considering how much back and forth it involves. But really, the narrative doesn't really progress until we get recaptured by Asav, during which we get reunited with Sam, and we do get some fun banter between Sam and Nadine, until Asav ends up forcing Chloe to reveal the tusk through solving a puzzle that reveals that Ganesh sacrificed himself to defend his father's honor. But through Asav now having the tusk, we, as you would expect, get left for dead as the room starts to fill with water, though obviously we end up breaking free, and this does lead us to Chapter 8. Where we do work alongside Nadine and Sam, which did feel very reminiscent to the sections in the original series where we would have Nate, Elena, and Sully together, where we have the core three navigating through these platforming sections. And this section is mostly fun, though I do find the cart pulling section kind of boring, and did also find it kind of jarring how Sam is kind of looked at as an afterthought here, with Chloe and Nadine obviously working well together here, and Sam just kind of coming off as the third wheel, which felt just very bizarre coming directly from Uncharted 4, where there he was obviously able to keep up with Nate throughout most of that game. Though to be fair, obviously this game does not focus on him. Obviously it's more focused on Chloe and Nadine. And this section is a nice payoff to that, but again, I just wish they kind of handled Sam's character a bit differently here, to make him feel a bit more in line with the previous installment. But eventually we do reach the rail yard where Asav is, where we find out that Asav is working with Shoreline and their newly appointed leader, Orca, Nadine's former lieutenant that betrayed her at the end of Uncharted 4, which is a cool callback, but also just a bizarre one considering who cares about Orca. But this is where we find out that Asav's true plan is that he is trading the tusk to Orca in exchange for a bomb that he is going to use to blow up the Indian capital to start a civil war for some reason. Like, I'll be honest, again, I never really fully understood Asav's motivations here for why he is so resolute in leading this rebellion and wanting this civil war, but to be honest, I never minded too much, as again, I still find Asav to be an intimidating villain either way. But this does lead to us having what is for me probably the most annoying fight in the entire game, where we do have to take down Orca's helicopter while also fighting a large group of guards in the rail yard, all of which have powerful weapons, and the helicopter also shooting at us at the same time. And again, this is just an annoying section to get through, especially when the only thing that damages the helicopter are RPGs that are rarely found throughout the area, most of which being in locked chests that you have to find. And again, like, I get it's structured similarly to that of like a boss battle, but again, I just don't find it fun to play. But after we do take the helicopter down, we do get a solid scene where Orca tries to kill Nadine, only for Sam to save her, and Nadine to end up killing Orca in response, really paying off the Sam and Nadine relationship, but also satisfying Nadine's vendetta against Orca here. But following this, we do get to Chapter 9, the final chapter, where now we have to catch up to Asav to stop the bomb, with Chloe being resolute in doing so. And really, the rest of the game ends up being this really massive set piece, where we do drive a Jeep to catch up to Asav's train, when after jumping onto it, we get a sequence very reminiscent to the train sequence from Uncharted 4, where we go from train car to get closer to the front. But this does also end up adding in elements of like the convoy set piece as well, where we do jump from Jeep to get further ahead. After reaching the front and being unable to stop the train, we do decide to redirect it, to which we regroup with Sam, in order to do so, but with Nadine still on the train, we get to the final section of the game where we have to rescue her, and in doing so, we have our final fight with Asav, which ends up being a really satisfying conclusion to the game, with Chloe and Nadine fully working together here. That does feel like a proper culmination to their arc across the story, and also is kind of mirroring that initial fight that we had at the beginning of the game, with us being introduced to their dynamic through a fistfight as well. But in true cinematic fashion here, the bomb ends up falling on Asav, leaving him stuck as the train goes off a collapsed bridge, and of course, Chloe and Nadine escape just in time as the train explodes under them. Again, feeling right out of an action movie here. And once they get to safety, we do get this beautiful shot as they overlook the city as the sun sets. And in what is an expected conclusion to the narrative here, Chloe and Nadine obviously agree to become partners in treasure hunting moving forward, which again perfectly sets up a potential sequel down the road. And they also agree to donate the tusk to the Ministry of Culture, which again shows some maturing from Chloe's end, during which we do humorously see Sam get upset, during which we abruptly cut to credits, though we do also get a mid-credit scene, which calls back to the beginning of the game, where we have the group now with Minu, as they eat pizza as Chloe promised her, and we have Sam begging Chloe to reconsider, which ends with Minu handing him a slice, which feels very cartoonish to me, especially as we see the characters like playing with cheese in the background as they're eating the pizza. So again, like, this is just a ridiculous scene, but really a fun one to end the game on. And overall, again, I do really enjoy The Lost Legacy here, especially considering its status as a spin-off to the series, with it being an interesting exploration of how the Uncharted series can progress without Nathan Drake. And while the game was initially conceived as a DLC, I do think that overall boons the pacing of the game, where it is obviously on a smaller scale, which I think leaves it as one of the more consistent Uncharted games out there, taking the improvements from Uncharted 4, but condensing the game's length to that of the length of a game from the original trilogy, making it kind of the best of both worlds, to the point where I could see an argument for this being the best game in the series. With the only reason I don't fully subscribe to that thought myself is because I do love how perfectly Uncharted 4 ends Nathan Drake's story, which gives it an edge, despite the fact that I do have massive pacing issues with that game. But The Lost Legacy here is still a fantastic experience, again feeling like a steady progression of the series while focusing on two previously underdeveloped characters, now given the depth that I wanted from them in their first appearances. So again, I really do love Uncharted: The Lost Legacy, and hope for similar titles like this moving forward from the Uncharted series. But with that, I've now done retrospectives on the two latest entries in the series, and I do plan on eventually getting around to doing the first three games as well. Now later in the year, it will be the 15th anniversary of Uncharted 1, so I do plan on doing a retrospective for that game then, and I guess we'll see when I do the other two. Don't really know when, but again, I would like to eventually. But really, those are my thoughts on Uncharted: The Lost Legacy. Thank you for watching.